all these kinds of foundations, right? They give grants to these universities, and that's how the universities, really drive their system, right? But, it's like anything else. If, I know as a young man, every now and again, I'd, borrow money or get money from grandma. Well, I got to tell you what, there were strings attached to that money. And I can guarantee you that when the universities go to the Ford Foundation or any of these tax-free foundations for money, there are strings attached, namely the selection of professors, the selection of university administration. And that's how this system is driven. Ecclesiastical, I think, is a really critical aspect to understand. It is not without understanding that socialists know that their system of government is totally antithetical to biblical Christianity. The two simply cannot coexist. Now, what they have found throughout history, and certainly prominent in the Soviet experiment, is that it is not possible through government power to destroy religion altogether. It just simply won't work. But what they have decided is that if you so pervert Christianity, you can essentially accomplish the same goal much more effectively. And that's exactly what's going on. And that is why you will see people like Richard Land, president of the Southern Baptist organization, who's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. You can see people like Rick Warren, right? Highly hyped media darling of evangelical Christianity, a member of Council on Foreign Relations. And when you actually look at books like The Purpose-Driven Life, right? These books, when you actually understand what he's talking about, deny the deity of Christ. They subvert the fundamental aspect of biblical Christianity. I think when you go to a lot of your large mega churches today, they're using I hate to even call it a version of the Bible. It's sort of a paratranslation called the Message Bible, right? This Bible, when you look at the key verses, especially in the Gospel of John, where it very clearly lays out the deity of Jesus Christ, it changes those versions, changes that wording. It denies the deity of Christ. And it is through that subversion that they're accomplishing this goal. And in my mind, the idea that we can retain biblical Christianity, this is going to be the one true key of restoration to our Constitution. And I would say that the ecclesiastical attack that the Council on Foreign Relations has is probably the most important aspect of what we have to understand and go by. So, oftentimes I get at this point that, well, you know what, Robert, if all this stuff was happening, certainly Walter Cronkite would have told us about it. Certainly we would have seen it in the news. It would have been explained. There's just no way all this is happening and we don't know about it. So with that, let me actually have Walter Cronkite himself explain this concept.
The World Federalist Association, or WFA, is one of the largest organizations that openly promote world government. Periodically, the WFA extends a Global Governance Award to a prominent individual pushing for the same goal. Former CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite was among the recipients of the WFA Award.
Thank you very much. Today we must develop federal structures on a global level to deal with world problems. We need a system of enforceable world law, a democratic federal world government.
In a closed-circuit hookup, Hillary Clinton congratulated Cronkite.
For decades you told us the way it is. But tonight, we honor you for fighting for the way it could be.
In 1993, the WFA honored an editor for Time magazine for an essay he had written entitled, "The Birth of a Global Nation."
Basically, as we know it, will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority.
After receiving the award, the editor, Stroke Talbot, was appointed Deputy Secretary of State in the Clinton administration.
Now this gives an illustration of how this works. Understand, it's not as though, you know, there are Dan Brokaw is being, you know, bribed by the CFR to you know, pass a certain viewpoint, but rather it is because as a younger man, before he reached that level, he came out and said, hey, I'm for this. That's what allowed him to move up the ranks to become chief anchorman at NBC. And you know, we see that example with Strobe Talbot. They come out and they openly advocate this point of view. They're not stupid. They understand how the world works. They understand who the movers and shakers are. They understand what it takes to achieve advancement. And they're willing to sell their souls to essentially have that monkey move up situation. That's what we're seeing in the media. I can remember in 2003, shortly after the war in Iraq started, there was Katie Couric, a foreign policy, Middle East foreign policy expert, and some retired general that were talking about how critical it is that we're in this war in Iraq, and how it's definitely linked to 9/11, and that there's weapons of mass destruction and all these kinds of things there. Well, at the time, my wife paused it when the names were up on the screen, and we got out a book that we had called Shadows of Power that has a membership list of members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and we did our little CFR check. And sure enough, Katie Couric was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Chief Foreign Policy Advisor was, as it turns out, the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor for the Council on Foreign Relations. And this general was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In fact, while he was in the military, he had spent a year on the government payroll at the CFR headquarters in New York, getting sort of indoctrinated in their system of understanding of foreign policy. And that's what was going on. So oftentimes that begs the question, well, what's the motivation? I mean, who are these people? And is like everybody in on this? How does this work? So by way of explaining this, and I think Barry Goldwater gave us a little bit of foreshadowing to this about how it's the, at the very top down that makes the policy, is this understanding that you're going to have top level operatives. Here we're talking about your David Rockefellers, your George Soroses, the real key movers and shakers. And their goal is this, and I will submit to you that it is not money. David Rockefeller's got plenty of cars, doesn't need another helicopter, doesn't need another mansion, he's got plenty of money. His goal is this, power. That's what it's about. It is about who makes the decision as to who's going to be the next editor of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Who's going to be making the decisions as to who moves up in government. Who's making the decisions as to who the president is. All right? That's what they're talking about. It's power. Now there's the puppets of the elite. Right? And here we're talking about the Barack Obamas, the George Bushes, the lower level mouthpieces, as it were. And their goal is this, self-aggrandizement, ego, money. I suppose for Bill Clinton it's an improved dating life that he gets out of the situation. All right? But they understand what it takes to move up, and they understand that doing business with these people is the quickest way to personal advancement. And that highlights for us a key understanding that for us to be involved in the pushback, in the restoration of our Constitution, a sense of morality is absolutely critical. Because these people are amoral. And as a result of that amorality, they're willing to do whatever it takes to advance. If we have folks in our movement that have the similar sense of amorality, right? Who knows when they're going to stab us in the back? Who knows when we're going to be betrayed? And so that needs to be a function. This concept of the ends justifies the means, this is a Marxist concept. This is not a Christian biblical concept. We have to reject that idea and understand that we must act in a moral, law-abiding way, regardless of how effective the other side might seem to be by using amorality as one of their tools. So again, to recap, at the top we have few, at the bottom we have many. and understand their motivation. So let's talk about the end goal. Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the key lieutenants in this movement, had this to say in his book, Between Two Ages. He says, "We cannot leap into world government through one quick step. The precondition for eventual and genuine globalization is progressive regionalization, because by that we move towards toward larger, more stable, more cooperative units." Now let me give you an example of that thought process. It's this. You know, if you're going to boil a frog, and you're not going to throw them in boiling water, they'll hop right out, but rather you put them in nice cool water, slowly turn up the heat, bam, you got cooked frog. Well, that's what they're doing. They're cooking us, you and I, right now. Let me give you a specific example of regionalization. Now, when I was in undergrad, I had an opportunity to get a scholarship. I traveled to England. I spent a year at Oxford University studying British imperial military history. During the break between semesters, I had the opportunity to travel around the continent. And what I can assure you, and you probably know this to be true yourself, is that Europe is a very diverse place. Food, culture, religion, manner of dress, work times, all this kind of stuff. A very diverse culture. I mean, the folks in the Greek islands would have almost no concept of what the British did. They're totally different styles. Yet today, this is amalgamated essentially into one federalized nation in which all the rules come out of Brussels. The independent nation states are essentially left just simply having the opportunity to rubber stamp various things. There is a central bank for Europe, a central currency, the euro, and you know, right now we're seeing the catastrophic results of exactly what's going on in Europe on that basis. Now, if they can merge Europe together, they certainly can do it in other areas, and in fact, that's exactly what they've done. So here today, you'll see the European Union, the African Union, the Asian Union, the Arab League, the Pacific Union, on and on and on. In the United States, there was a push called the Free Trade Area of the Americas. In order to set that up, they did CAFTA and NAFTA, various free, so-called free trade agreements to start building this together specifically for this purpose. And the push was to have a North American Union. Now they call it the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And recently, yeah, they changed the names because there's been a lot of pushback. And recently there was a big WikiLeaks disclosure of inside government documents leaking exactly what this push is all about. Now, to explain how these things are put together behind the scenes is David Rockefeller here.
A special televised meeting of the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations provides a window to the real story. The speaker, Vice President Dick Cheney, takes a question from David Rockefeller.
Vice President, I just enjoyed so much your whole speech, but I was particularly pleased that you gave such a strong endorsement for the free trade agreement for all the Americans, subject that has been of great concern to me for many years, and particularly recently, and I think it's absolutely essential for the strength of our economy.
Rockefeller's role in the drive for an FTAA was a lot more central than he portrays. Rockefeller cultivated Latin American leaders who could be counted on to support such a proposal. Both the 1994 Miami Summit and the FTAA proposal were conceived and nurtured by a Rockefeller-created network. Prominent among the organizations sponsoring the Miami event were the Council of the Americas, founder and honorary chairman, David Rockefeller. The Americas Society, chairman, David Rockefeller. The Forum of the Americas, founder, David Rockefeller. The Institute for International Economics, financial backer and board member, David Rockefeller. The Trilateral Commission, founder and honorary chairman, David Rockefeller.
So, you sort of create this illusion that there's all these different organizations, and of course when you follow the money back, it comes back to a single source. Now, let me put it in perspective here in terms of the beginnings of the Council on Foreign Relations, and then we'll wrap this up. Colonel Edward Mandell House was the key political operative in the Woodrow Wilson administration. He was essentially the Karl Rove and Rahm Emanuel of the Wilson administration. Wilson himself said that he didn't do anything without Colonel House's permission. I had the opportunity recently to buy some volumes called The Intimate Papers of Colonel Edward Mandell House, which is a collection of his personal correspondences. And when you see the letters back and forth between House and Wilson, it's abundantly clear who the boss is, who's wearing the pants in the family, and it isn't the president. There's one instance in which House is telling him what to do, and relates that the president went right over to his typewriter and started personally typing out and taking dictation from House. There's an explanation in there that when in 1913, as Woodrow Wilson is touring Europe, he was to be introduced to the Kaiser and to other leaders of Europe as the, and this is a direct quote, real power behind the throne in the United States. Interestingly enough, the concept for the League of Nations was already put together in 1913. That's specifically the reason House was touring Europe. And he writes back lamenting that relations between Germany and England were actually getting better. And as a result of that, people weren't buying into this League of Nations concept, and that, geez, we got to do something about that. Well, something was done about that. Now, Edward Mandell House wrote the book Philip Drew, and in this book, he very clearly lays out what his goals are for the United States. He says, first of all, we are looking for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He made this very clear. In fact, the book is dedicated to Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian radical communist activist that was very prominent in the Italian socialist movement. Now he says, to accomplish this goal, we need the following. We need an income tax. And in 1913, that's exactly what he accomplished, the income tax. He says, we need a national bank, the Federal Reserve. And again, in 1913, that's exactly what was accomplished. He says, we need to have a social security system. Now again, that wasn't something that was accomplished during the Wilson administration, but was followed up and was enacted in the Roosevelt administration. He says we need to restructure the U.S. Constitution. He hated the United States Constitution because it limited powers. He hated that system, wanted to restructure that. He says we need an imperial presidency, somebody that can make decisions, and that's it. And I would argue today that's essentially what we have. And then lastly, he said we need world government, because by this method we can totally dominate the planet. Well, the cornerstone then of the Wilson administration became the League of Nations. That was their chief focus following World War I. And what happened was there were a number of very bright senators at the time who realized this for what it was and said absolutely no. 7 months the debate raged, and finally they voted it down. Now this was a disaster in the Wilson administration. I mean, this was overall the key thing they wanted to get accomplished, right? And for a radical socialist, if you've got a crisis, what's the one thing you don't want to have happen? Let it go to waste. And here it is, this wonderful crisis went to waste. Oh, it was a disaster. So what they said is, all right, here's what we're going to do. They stayed in Europe, and they said, we have to form organizations that can dominate policy, and that's exactly what they did. And in 1921, the Council on Foreign Relations was founded specifically for the function then of, thank you very much, of pushing forward this idea so that the next time this crisis came up, it would not be wasted. So we'll fast forward to 1945 now. recall World War II started when what country was attacked? Anybody remember? Poland? Right? It was Poland. Now, what oftentimes is forgotten, right? Everybody remembers Nazi Germany attacked Poland, right? But they weren't the only ones, were they? Who else attacked Poland? Russia, that's right. The Soviet Union. The famed Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Nazi non-aggression pact of 1939. But here it is in 1949, we essentially surrendered by treaty Poland to the Russians. Well, if this war got started because the Soviet Union attacked Poland, and here at the end of the war we're saying, hey, you can have Poland? What's going on? It just doesn't make any sense. So this is certainly one of the more famous photographs at Yalta, the big three, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. Now, the key operative at this conference was this fella here. You may not recognize the photo, but I'm sure you recognize the name. That's Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was Roosevelt's chief advisor. Here's a rather interesting photo. This is Roosevelt here. There's Churchill. There's Joe Stalin there. And speaking into Roosevelt's ear hole right there, that's Alger Hiss. All right, he was the key operative that was driving that, and one of their key things was established after the war and was discussed and hammered out at the Yalta Conference of the United Nations. Now, in 1946, the United Nations was founded in San Francisco. This is a photo from the founding conference. That is Alger Hiss. He was the acting Secretary General. Essentially, he was the first Secretary General of the United Nations. That is Molotov right there. This is the American delegation arriving in San Francisco. 90% of its members were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this is Alger Hiss arriving in Washington with the UN Charter. It's in a bomb-proof, fire-proof, floating box with a parachute on it. So I guess they thought it was fairly important. Now, if you've never read the UN Charter, get online and take a look at it, because it is total opposite of our system of government. Our system of government says our rights come from God, and the purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights. But in the UN Charter system, it's very different. It says rights come from government, and government can regulate those rights however they want, and subject to change. A totally different system of government. Now, Alger Hiss, as we know today, is a Soviet agent, was from the get-go. The Venona Papers were releases of Soviet communications between the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and Moscow that outed Alger Hiss as a Soviet agent. So there's no doubt that this entire design was a communist effort from the get-go. We also have further evidence. Anatoly Golitsyn was a high-ranking KGB officer who defected in the 1960s, wrote a number of books outlining what this was all about. Also outlining this concept, and this was in the 60s, that there was going to be a movement towards glasnost and perestroika and this coming together. And he pointed out that this is a total fraud. These are the same communists that are in charge and don't buy it at all. And in fact, when you look at what he was talking about in the 60s and you fast forward to the 80s and 90s, it was like 97% accurate. Again, these books you can get on Amazon.com. So what they needed then was a new boogeyman, because they had been using the Soviet Union to scare the bejeebers out of the American people so they could get away with whatever they wanted to in government. And what they decided, first they looked at, well, maybe we'll scare people with population control, maybe we'll scare them with environmental disasters, and in fact, they first started with this idea of global cooling. Maybe some of you can even remember that from the 70s, where they said, oh, it's global cooling. But they decided, you know what, nothing quite works like a good old shooting war and some turmoil, and what we need to do is find a group of people that nobody knows anything about, and aren't pansies. If we get up in their face, they'll push back. And so they decided, we've got the perfect people to act as the new boogeyman so people don't know who the real enemy is. And they found these guys in the Middle East. Now this here, Yasser Arafat, he also won the Nobel Peace Prize, go figure. From day one, he was a Soviet-trained agent. There's no doubt about that. In this photo, that there is his KGB handler. We know this, of course, because one of his financial attachés with the KGB, Lieutenant General Pasipa, defected later to the West and wrote a book about it and explained very candidly that he was Yasser Arafat's bagman. He brought him $200,000 a month and instructions from Moscow on how to operate, creation of Hamas and all these organizations. That was a put-on job from the Russians to begin with. And if we fast forward to today, the same thing applies. I would argue that Osama bin Laden may have been the front guy for Al-Qaeda, but was not really the true power behind it. The true power was this guy, Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was, in fact, you know, the brains behind 9/11. He was the financial guy that helped carry out these things. And again, we know this because there was a KGB, now it's called FSB, but same thing, defector named Alexander Litvinenko, who came out and said, hey, this is who these guys are. These are KGB agents. This is a KGB operation. Alexander Litvinenko, as some of you might remember in the news, was later assassinated in London, was poisoned and sort of withered away and died in London after his